So I wanted to take you through a little bit of a recap from what we talked about last week, just in case you missed it. And we talked about the emergence of spaces for lesbian and queer women, but also linking their creation to a longer history of feminism and activism, especially around HIV activism as well. And then we moved on to looking at the different commercial infrastructures that existed for lesbian and queer women and compared them to some of those commercial infrastructures for gay men. And we sort of ended on the note that these were precarious spaces. They were commercially unstable, they were temporary spaces, they were often borrowed, but they're a very deeply hard won. And that type of precarity does something. It makes all sorts of investments to space matter. And there was a beautiful quote that I wanted to read last week, which I ran out of time because we were nattering about God knows what. So I just want to quote now, because I think that's really going to set the scene, as it were, on how we're going to talk through what happens when scenes die, when the dyke bar disappears. So often what counts as queer intimacy is more difficult to determine for those who are not directly involved in its making. And this gestures at so much of what the dyke bar represents for our communities in Sydney. So Lauren Ballant and Michael Warner, in talking about queer sex, say, queer culture has found it necessary to develop knowledges in mobile sites of drag, youth culture, music, dance, parades, flaunting and cruising sites, whose mobility makes them possible, but also renders them hard to recognise as world-making because they are so fragile and ephemeral.
And given, I guess, this fragility and all that we've been talking about, the precarity of these spaces, today we really want to think about what is actually going on and what happens when these spaces close down, as they are all around the world. We see this in lots of different contexts. How are these spaces mourned? What is the kind of losses that are felt? And what does the future hold? And where can we maybe see these spaces start again?
Yeah, absolutely. So last week we were talking about events, both past and present, for and by lesbian and queer women, but how they constitute social scenes. And I didn't get the chance to get into this last week, so I'm just going to take a moment to explain this idea, because I think we're going to use this as we carry on through the talk. So to me, when we're talking about scenes, we're talking about two kind of dynamics or levels. The first thing is that we use the word scene in our everyday language to sort of describe a concentration of people, places and practices that might coalesce around a particular phenomenon or a particular cultural or visible feature. And I think about this as scenes as a social entity. So this is where scenes have a kind of materiality and a tangibility that you don't necessarily recognise at the time, but it's just a way that we use to describe these things. But the second, and also when we're thinking about dyke bars, we can see this actually operates as a bit of a social scene, because it's not just about drinking, it's also about dancing, catching up, hooking up. It's a whole range of sort of peripheral activities that come to take place around these sort of spaces, around these dyke bars.
And really key features of those dyke bars that come to focus a lot in the memories of these spaces as well. So even just sitting here and looking across at the pool table as part of this exhibition, those kinds of objects and memories of what the space looked like and felt like, smelled like, all those kinds of sensory things that we're going to talk about today really form part of that imaginary.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that you can feel and you can touch and you can smell. And we'll talk about smells a little bit later. The second dynamic, or the second level of social scenes, is what I call the social imaginary. So these are the types of cultural energies that get produced and they circulate around these sites. And this is especially the case when they're felt to be intangible or, precarious or unstable. And they prompt all these different investments into maintaining them. And so they sort of offer a promise that something is more possible in this space than just a place to buy alcohol.
That's really interesting, because I think I've been thinking a lot about the kind of imaginary of dyke bars. I mean, for some as this kind of utopian space, or like at, the best of times, that has been what it's felt like for some people, and through the different generations, different dyke spaces, lesbian spaces have felt like a very safe, open, affirming space, and for some a utopian space, the kind of idea of what a perfect kind of world could look like, though that kind of definition of utopian space has shifted across each generation, and the parameters of that looks quite different. And certainly in the 60s and 70s, what we were talking about last week, the kind of emergence of women's spaces felt very promising and unprecedented and new and exciting. And in the 80s and 90s, as sort of women's spaces, dyke spaces expand and encompass new kind of energies and new music, new communities, new possibilities for lesbian communities. Again, the kind of definitions of what that space should and could look like changes. It's always changing, but yeah, this kind of imaginary of the coming to the Dyke Bar and feeling affirmed and safe, feeling connected, that is an ongoing kind of feeling, I think.
I think that's what forms that type of social imaginary, and that makes the Dyke Bar a pretty special place. But also, just to reiterate what you were saying, this is not a static imaginary. This is shifts. It's spawned from and is for community as well. So it responds to those shifts in communities over time. So what I want us to think about when we're thinking about the lesbian bar or the Dyke Bar is how shared experiences, effects and identities are generated through these almost everyday processes of participation. And so the bar is sort of part of our everyday life, but it also stands up as something outside of the mundane, as something more special. And I think that's the case, even if it no longer exists. And this is a special claim that I'm trying to make here. And also, if you're interested more in that theoretical underpinning of it, this is the book. It's only available in hardcover. Thank you, Sophie. So if you can't get hold of it, just email me and I'll get you a copy. So I want to start thinking about how this kind of social imaginary can outlast the materiality of the Dyke Bar. And so I want to return back to one of my favourite places, the Sly Fox Hotel, which, as you know, is now no longer. So at the height of its popularity on Wednesday nights at the Drag King events, masses of people would be crammed into these really tight spaces comprising the Sly Fox Hotel's interior, pushing up and pressing up against each other in the dark, jostling for room within the crowded dance floor, while roars of approval for the drag kings on stage filled the air. And so one regular audience member told me back in the day that the charged atmosphere in these hot, crowded spaces was one where desire circulated with such force that you could smell it in the air. But in September 2012, the venue management of the Sly Fox Hotel ceased hosting the Drag King events that had run for a decade prior to that. And the venue management at the time had cited economic reasons, but there had been, as we mentioned last week, a really long history of complicated negotiations between management and event producers. But in fact, this cessation was actually preceded by another small closure in early 2012 when their venue closed for renovations. So over a couple of weeks, it closed, and when we reopened, we found that the management had replaced the old carpet, repainted the walls, installed new furniture, extended the stage area, and improved the lighting and sound. So, I mean, in most of cases, when you think about venues undergoing these renovations, it's in response to gentrification, the need to sort of zhuzh up the space in order to attract more patrons. But I think here the venue management might have made a bit of an error because so many of the regular Drag King attendees were just pissed off at this renovated space. So first of all, the renovations were experienced as disconnected from the historical materiality of the venue. And I'm going to read this quote that one person gave me at the time of my research because it is a cracker. So when it first reopened, this person and I went back into the Sly Fox Hotel, and this is what she recounted to me. Because I've been going there for so many years, from the time it was a dance floor in the front and the dance floor in the back as it is now, to the time when we've just relaid the carpets. I remember I was with you, Kerryn, the first night we walked in there and we were like, what the hell has happened? This carpet is nice. We were walking around making these spongy effects with our feet, because when you first walked into the Sly Fox, you think, okay, this is the Sly Fox. It's got to be dirty. It's going to smell like stale alcohol, and it's going to smell like lesbians. So apparently lesbians have a smell. Do you know that?
I would say yes. I'm not quite sure.
Bottle this,
I'm sure I can describe
this fantastic scent that we can use.
Yeah.
Anyway, so not only then for this person did the venue facilitate the maintenance of these lesbian-centered relationships, the venue was understood to be literally permeated by the odour of these relationships.
I love that. I love the sensory engagement there. But interestingly, I think my experience of the Sly Fox, which was pretty foundational, was probably in this period after the renovations that you're talking about. So I guess I went into the more zhuzhed version of the Sly Fox. But yeah, it was definitely still foundational. There was definitely still the kind of energy and vibe, the excitement. I went on my first, I guess it was my initiation into Dyke Night and kind of just Dyke culture generally. But going along with a friend who definitely knew the scene much better than I was I was probably trembling. I think I definitely was trembling. But yeah, being in there, being in a bar, in a pub, and just it being just packed with women, with queer women, that memory will never leave me. I was sort of in my early 20s, but even then I felt quite older than a lot of, I don't know, it was a very different.
You did have a very young energy.
Yeah, it was
certain times. I mean, who can stay out till 3 o'clock in the morning on a Wednesday night?
Absolutely. Well, it was, yeah, I felt old. And
I feel old all the time, so
you're not old, it's fine. Yeah, I think what I remember is sort of similar anecdotes to a lot of the people you interview, just that sort of crowded energy, great music. It was a great DJ on that night. I saw an older lesbian off to the side, and I went up and rather excitedly told her that I was there for the first time, and she sort of leaned over and said to just go with it. And I just thought in that moment this was a prophet, and I just did, and it was, the rest is history. But yeah, that was my Sly Fox memory for the archive.
Yeah, but when you've been talking, your research centres on those earlier decades. So is there some connection between those and the sort of feeling when you were in Sly Fox for the first time?
Absolutely. I think at any event, any sort of women's space, whether it be sort of in the 70s, the emergence of more queer women's lesbian spaces in the 80s and 90s, there is just this emphasis on what it felt like to be in a room full of women who are marking that they are there for other women, that their desires are welcome. And there are various things that they would recall that were part of this, that made this energy possible. And that was the lesbian DJ ruling the decks. It was the sound. It was the dancing side by side with other lesbians close together, drinking alongside them. And actually, and this is a common through all the decades, especially in the 80s and 90s, the toplessness, the dancing and partying topless, chest bared confidently, acknowledging that this was kind of a radical act, knowing that this was often a kind of, I guess, practice or way experiencing the scene that was more commonly associated with gay men, but lesbians were really doing that and owning it and challenging a lot of sexist and homophobic ideas about how they should use their bodies. And that was something that really, really stuck. And that goes back to the sort of lesbian gatherings of the 70s. A lot of toplessness mentioned in the interviews, a lot of hair cutting rituals as well. I just find those kind of embodied aspects to these spaces really interesting. A lot of going to an event and just having the floor awash with hair because everybody's decided to get a haircut and mark their sort of radical identities in a really important way.
This is what makes spaces lesbians. It's not lesbian spaces, sorry. It's not just the sort of commercial investments. It's all these other minor ways that people engage with each other that then create these spaces.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And on that, another important factor in the enjoyment of these spaces and in the creation of, I guess, what we're kind of calling a dyke energy, drugs, sort of recreational drug use has been an important part of the scene for many people and has, shifted over the decades as well, the different kinds of drugs in the scene. But that is definitely featured in a lot of the interviews that I've conducted with various generations. That has, featured prominently in the way that they enjoyed and remember the scene.
Yeah, and I mean, Kerryn Drysdale has done a lot of work on the role of drugs in the creation of or constitution of gay male spaces, party spaces. And I think this is definitely an area that we can reorient ourselves when we're thinking about women's use of space and their use of drugs as well. But also just to acknowledge that because of the alcohol and because of the drugs, for some people who decided that wasn't going to be part of their life anymore, those places did become a little bit vexed. And some people had to withdraw from those spaces in order to maintain the sobriety or the choices that they make around drug and alcohol use as well. So we want to acknowledge that these aren't, they might feel utopian, especially for those people that feel immersed in these spaces, but sometimes it works in the opposite way for some people.
Completely, yeah. And I guess we're talking a lot about, the energy and the kind of memories of these spaces, because a lot of them have started to dwindle and close and are becoming increasingly sparse all around the world, not just bars, but lesbian and queer women's bookshops, festivals, a whole range of events that have been important for the kind of history of these communities. And we want to, I guess, talk a little bit about why that is, or some arguments for why that is. One huge one being gentrification. and various neighbourhoods losing their kind of queer radical edge because of rising rents, residential and commercial, kind of vulnerable communities being pushed out by those rent hikes, and spaces closing down as a result. But, you know, gentrification has always kind of been going on. I mean, look at communities like in neighbourhoods like Newtown. There's kind of been waves of gentrification there, but then there's still been this ongoing lesbian and queer women's presence, though always changing.
So, I mean, I would say that gentrification is one factor.
Yeah.
But we can't, as much as we might like to, we just can't solely blame gentrification.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, I want to bring up another reason. This is one that's often talked about, and it's a little controversial. And so there's this idea or this speculation that the decline of the dyke bar and women's spaces have been declined because of the rising membership of trans and gender diverse people in our communities. So this is the idea where, especially for drag king performances, for example, that this might not be a viable form of entertainment for people who have this aspect of their lived experience, and therefore it becomes politically inappropriate. And rightly so for some of the very extreme parodies of drag king performances as well. But look, I don't actually hold this to be, again, a sole reason. And in fact, when you look back at a lot of the literature around drag king performance groups, those empirical studies, trans and gender diverse people have had such a massive contribution to the creation of drag king events and nights, and to that atmosphere as well around them. And so certainly in Sydney, we had some amazing performers who now identify as trans men or non-binary people. And even looking at our history with drag queens in Australia, I mean, looking at the role of lay girls and the amazing contribution by trans women. And so for me, that argument doesn't hold, and especially because there's so many of us in the lesbian and queer communities who love our trans friends and our trans lovers. So I just want to put that one to rest, because I think that this is it circulates every so often, and for me, I just don't think it's backed up historically or empirically.
Yeah, and there's also heaps of historical evidence, especially in an Australian context, of the intersections of these communities. There's lots more points of connection that we need to explore and want to explore and celebrate. Like, I'm thinking about some of the examples we mentioned last week, like Dyke Sydney in the 80s and 90s, the arrival of Wicked Women, a publication and a series of events and parties that celebrated a spectrum of gender and sexualities. They're definitely organised around the idea of creating a safe, sexy, separate space for lesbians and queer women to centre their gaze, but not at the exclusion of, welcoming the community.
Yeah, I mean, at the same time, having said that, these places were quite aesthetically policed.
Yes.
So they could be quite uncomfortable for women, as well as trans and gender diverse members of the community as well. Especially femme presenting women were made to feel uncomfortable sometimes. So, while we hark on about the utopian nature of this, we also want to point out these are not homogenous, and they really depend on a whole range of intersecting dynamics as to how comfortable a person is allowed to feel in these spaces.
Completely. The parameters of this community are changing all the time, and yes, absolutely. The aesthetics completely, and femme visibility in the scene hugely. Like it's always shifting. So another, I guess, argument being made for kind of the closure of these scenes is, again, their loss of relevance in an increasingly queer and expansive community in which we don't necessarily have the same need and connection for LGBTQ specific spaces, and the kind of decline of this idea of the gayborhood, that specific areas, scenes, venues that were once a really important part of, for instance, gay men's scenes and specifically lesbian scenes are no longer connected to those same communities in the same ways. Yeah.
I mean, the argument's been made that the importance of an LGBTQ identity is now diminished, and that people no longer feel the need to settle residentially in those geographic spaces, those concentrated spaces. But we've been talking about this, and I think that when we look at the mobile geographies that we talked about last week, especially that characterises lesbian social life, you don't need to have those patterns of residency. And we've looked at the characterisation of places as lesbian through the sort of like informal investments that people make. And I think that maybe when we're looking at well-settled, middle-aged lesbians and gay men like myself, there's no longer a need to settle in those geographical concentrated spaces. But for young people who are coming out and looking for, their place to belong, I think that those places are still really important. And so for me, I don't think the argument for that wholly holds as the sole reason yet again.
Yeah. I think that's also interesting, interviewing a few lesbian promoters and DJs about changes in the scene. One comment that was made is that just the changes even in dating app culture and the kind of different imperatives now for going out to actually meet, hook up, form relationships has really changed the scene as well. Just a different need to actually go and find your space, to find your community, has shifted with, I guess, the growth of the online culture as well.
Yeah, so lots of different shifts. But look, the other thing the fourth reason that I just wanted to draw attention to is that scenes are by their nature disruptive and precarious. They have a momentum, they sort of emerge, they gain popularity, and then often they decline. And I think that's part of the way that scenes function. And so when we're talking about social scenes, no scene can last forever. Time moves on, things change. At various event promoters that the scene depended on for its ongoing maintenance, maybe get another job or find another interest. Performers get older, move into the more stable forms of employment, or look for different ways that maybe pay a little bit more than $100 a night for a performance. And people get old and they couple up and they move away. And so when we're thinking about all those networks and those energies, they shift over time as well. So I think that we can probably take maybe a little bit from those reasons and think about them together and look at the way that they may have influenced the closure of dyke bars around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've also been talking about what are some of the broader legacies of these scenes that we really want to emphasize because they have ongoing implications for our community. And one of them has been the connection between the party scene and harm reduction, health, and just models of care for people in our community. And we've both done kind of research in this area, and mine really centers on, I guess, the emergence of sexual health activism pioneered by lesbian event promoters, the people that attended lesbian events, that stood at the door holding a bucket literally for the HIV/AIDS resources and support networks, for the memorial quilt, for the lesbian and gay anti-violence project, for women's refuges, for so many different causes that were critical to the safety and ongoing survival of many different people in the community. And gradually also many of these events really highlighting the gap in sexual health resources and awareness amongst lesbians and queer women, that there was really very little available. Some of these events in the 80s and 90s for lesbians were some of the first to actually supply lesbians with safe sex packs and provide sexual health resources and workshops to even explore different sexual scenarios.
And
all
what the
kinds
hell
of
is a dental dam?
Yes, well, yeah, we could have a whole nother talk about the dental dam and its arrival in Australia, and does anyone know what
Does anyone use it
to do? But also, these have really, really ongoing important implications. So things like the SWASH lesbian, bisexual and queer women's health surveys that ACON has been running since the late 1990s, I think 1996, that emerges out of these grassroots community initiatives at lesbian parties and events where there's just some very, very basic yet important fundraising going on and awareness raising around the gap in sexual health resources for lesbians and queer women.
And the SWASH survey has been, I think, the longest running lesbian survey in the world. So shout out to Julie Mooney-Summers and Rachel Deacon for keeping that alive, because it's a fantastic resource. Look at it online if you haven't, because it has some great summaries of how the patterns and behaviours in our communities have shifted over time.
Yeah,
it's really interesting. So one of the things we just wanted to end on then was looking forward into the future and what we see as being some of the shifts, the future projections, but also how we might be able to harness some of the past learnings to aid these future scenes. So I think one of the major things that we're seeing right now, especially in the age of COVID, is how space itself is changing, our engagement with space. If we can no longer go into the dyke bar, if it exists, without getting your temperature checked and limiting it to 20 people sitting inside, then maybe we need to rethink about how we can engage with each other So obviously online modes of engagements, as Sophie mentioned earlier, is a really important area. We can see also that there are around the world, drag king performances haven't stopped, they've just moved online. So you can actually log on and watch the most recent one, I think, was Drag Kings Around the World, and Rocket Amore represented Australia, and people could literally view drag king performances from their living room. And also there's a new initiative from the new UNSW galleries from the exhibition Friendship is a Way of Life. Dyke TV will be starting up soon on a Friday night. So I think the first one is at the end of October, 24th or something. Yeah, so join in for that, log in for that. But also I think the second Dyke TV is going to feature drag king performances. So that's going to be lots of fun for me, at least.
Yes, yeah. Definitely.
So yeah, we need to rethink about space. We need to think about how we're engaging in space. What are some other things that we wanted to look at?
I guess it's also just interesting being in this exhibition space and reflecting on, like, with the absence of these spaces, how are people going to, especially younger generations, going to feel connected to their history, and to, and meeting with different generations of queer people and learning in those ways and feeling connected in those ways.
And I also think when we're looking at queer party scenes now and in the future, we can see them as a little bit more, well, hopefully more inclusive spaces. And we did talk about the utopian imaginary of the Dyke Bar, and again recognising that it wasn't necessarily always a welcoming space for every single person. So how can we build inclusivity into those spaces? And I think that Heaps Gay, which is a great queer party scene, have been really engaging with that. They've got a really fantastic, beautiful, inclusive community ethos. But also one of the challenges is how do you stop then this really special place for queer people sort of getting appropriated by the cis-het kind of audiences. And I think chatting to Kat, one of the things that she mentioned was actually dialing down on the promotion of things, keeping them within existing networks, limiting sales to online sales rather than door sales. And this is a really tricky line to tread. And I'm not envious that I'm not at all envious of what Kat has to do here, and other beautiful queer party promoters as well. I think the main thing is that you just want to have a sign that says no cis-het men, really, right? Absolutely. And you can't really do that. So we really need to think about some of those ways that we can rethink about engaging with spaces and engaging with each other. The other thing that we want to do is to, and this is where we really want to invite people to add their thoughts to the chat line, because we have a few minutes that we'd like to engage with you directly through the chat, is to think about how we can use the sort of the legacy of the word lesbian, of the word dyke, but not easily fall into that trap of turfiness. So that's trans exclusionary radical feminists, those, I'll say it, I think some misguidance over who constitutes a woman. And so how can we keep this word alive, I think, when at the moment we know that it's mirrored in such controversy around the world. I won't even mention some of those people because I know that the name is such a trigger for people who've had to deal with the sort of transphobia that stemmed from this person's position. But I really feel like that we can maybe reclaim lesbian, or not even reclaim it, but just enhance its non-turfy dynamics. It's a tricky thing.
Yeah, or just to illuminate its really very dynamic history as well, where it's come from and how it's intersected with a range of different activisms. I think certainly for me as a historian of lesbian feminism, I very much feel that that it is, and who has interviewed a lot of people that have identified as lesbian feminists and have been part of the kind of activism cultures and scenes we're talking about, they are very much not TERFs, and I think their history is important to illuminate, and that's the kind of lesbian culture I'm definitely excited about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Should we turn to some questions? I think move the chat over to our audience.
Yeah, so we'll open up the chat line. So feel free to jot in some questions, some comments. We want this to be a really engaging, interactive moment.
I'm just going to try and log in from access the chat by getting the phone to work. Oh, here we go. Great.
We're actually borrowing somebody else's phone.
And it's not an iPhone, so I'm very confused. Okay, try again.
Anyway, so while Sophie's doing that, I'm going to tell you about the first time I went to the Sly Fox Hotel.
Of course, I want to hear this.
So I had been living in Newtown for a little while and hadn't quite come to terms with my sexuality. And then I had a very gay a very lovely queer woman as a flatmate. And so she said to me on one Wednesday night, we were at the Cordy having some beers, and she said, "Come on, let's go up to the Sly." And I'm like, "What? What is the Sly?" She's like, come on, I'll come with me. And we literally joined what felt to be like a column of women walking up from the intersection on King Street all the way up Inmore Road. It was just so many masses of black jeaned, black singleted women walking up to the Sly Fox Hotel. And I had no idea what I was going to see when I got there. So we got in and it was crowded as hell, as those who went there will probably remember. I couldn't even see the stage. I remember just being like crushed in with all of these people, and there were these roars and laughter and claps and things. And it was like, oh, there's a performance happening. And so for me, that was always my interest in the Sly Fox. It wasn't so much about the drag king performances that took place. It was the sort of dyke energy that these nights produced. And that's sort of like a thing that I found myself tapping into. I think that first night I stayed there until about 3 o'clock in the morning. Don't even know how I got home. Definitely woke up with a hangover the next day, and I was there again the next week.
That's an amazing story. Did you put that in your book?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, good. I'm so glad. Okay, I can't get the questions to load on here, so maybe we'll try on the actual computer, which is that one there.
No, I think it could be where I was.
Oh,
I think it might be
this one. Okay,
so I don't think we have any comments yet.
That's probably why. Okay, it wasn't my phone skills. Okay. All right. Well, that's okay. Let's just chat.
Yeah. So,
we do.
We do.
Okay.
We don't have ours up. So sorry.
Let's see. Publish.
Oh, you can get a chance to admire my.
Here we go. Great.
Makeup.
How do we gather people safely during COVID aside from online activities?
Well, so Heaps Gay, again, like thinking about Kat Dopper's work, she's doing that right now. They have a series of drag king events happening every so often at the Vanguard. I think that's the name of the venue. If it's changed its name, then you remember the Vanguard, right? And so they're very COVID safe. You book your tables of 4 people. It's a sit down thing only, no mingling in the bar. And then from the safety of your seats, you can watch the drag king performances on stage. So that's an example. And I think, to be honest, I don't think this COVID thing's going to go away soon. And so I think we're going to really have to adjust to new ways of gathering together, new ways of finding community outside of crowding into these spaces, because that's not COVID safe.
Yeah, and keeping in mind there are vulnerable members of our community. We want to keep kind of health as a focus as well. And of course, but it's tricky.
And I think the thing we need to do right now is to reach out to our community members. Those people who are less socially mobile for various reasons, or less physically mobile as well, and find out how people are doing and catch up that way.
Completely.
Yeah.
All right, we have another question. Do you think that the increasing focus on lesbian history through publications, so for instance, the work of Rebecca Jennings, films, TV series and documentaries, so one soon to be on Wicked Women, Australasian lesbian movement, will help to correct warped popular notions of TERF? 100%. Yeah, that's what's so exciting about this kind of groundswell of new research and focus and, broad popular interest in these movements. And especially I'm looking forward to the Wicked Women series. Have you heard about that? It's being in development, and just I'm so excited about that and that story and its origins. Because
so
it speaks to that
page and follow that for those people who want to engage online.
Absolutely. Yeah. Did you want to?
Well, I think that's really important. Look, the other thing as well is that one of the things that historians like Sophie, ethnographers like me try to grapple with is that the sort of analysis and research into these more everyday social interactions that constitute social scenes and that are generative of community are actually often considered by funders and such to be quite insignificant. And so we're constantly battling against the idea that, first of all, that the internet archives everything, and so we didn't have to worry about it, because that's patently not true. But also that, who's going to fund for this exploration into lesbian and queer social scenes? I mean, Sophie and I have first-hand example of that. We put in an ARC application. Our aim was to map the hidden social scenes from the 1970s through the 2000s, and to try to pull out some of those really innovative harm reduction, health promotion, and sexual health initiatives that took place in community and intra-community, and to try to harness them for our future queer communities, because we're going to see some of those same issues, even in our new COVID world, still affecting people. And you can think about those initiatives like Dancewise and Rovers, to be born from those amazing initiatives. That's one example, but there's possibly multitudes, many more. Unfortunately, we weren't funded. The ARC didn't give us the money. So, you know, if you want the research done,
fund us.
Yeah, we're ready to go. We've got our research plan and our design. Little plug for us.
We're ready. Okay. Okay. Someone thanking us for clarifying our position about TERFs and SWERFs. Thank you for that comment. That's absolutely. Nick says, how do we create new spaces, events for intergenerational dialogues between older lesbians and dykes and younger lesbians and queer women? How can archives and histories support this sort of dialogue? Great question.
This was supposed to be that space.
Yeah, this is that space. We're sitting amongst the promise of that. This is a space where people are invited to come listen and hear from different members of the community, different generations, to hear what it was like for them. I think there's footage online of this in action, and it's really compelling. It's a very powerful thing to hear from older people in our community, to hear what life was like, how it's changed, and for them to hear what's I guess important for us as well.
I mean, that's where I think thinking through space.
Yeah.
How can we create spaces for people to interact, and that it's not being exclusionary? So, this was always Marcon Reed's aim, was that this installation would create a community space that would bring intergenerational lesbian and queer women to talk, a space to talk to each other. Obviously the dyke bar that is not an installation might be a little bit difficult for older lesbians to access. It's late at night, it's quite noisy. So this was a way to sort of recreate the feeling, the energy, and allow for a space where people can talk. And going back to that, on the Friendship is a Way of Life exhibition page, you can actually see the video that is built around this installation, and you can see already the types of intergenerational conversations that were taking place. So it was a fantastic installation.
And also in terms of the archives, there on the walls around us, there are local archival images, I think from the Australian Lesbian and Gay Archives, which is a great resource for connecting with this history. That people coming, thank you for that question, Nick. People coming into this exhibition can engage with some really beautiful, wonderful archival images, original pamphlets and flyers from a lot of the events that we've been talking about today, some much earlier than what we've covered. But it's really...
talk to researchers and talk to archivists. So Nick Henderson is the face, almost, I think, of ALGA, of the Australian Lesbian and Gay Archives. And I have not met a more generous person who is more willing to talk about the histories, and to really, I think Nick's fantastic focus is to really bring in that intergenerational dynamic, to create those spaces in the archives where we can talk about those longer legacies.
Absolutely.
And I just think it's super important, because we don't have the sort of archive methods or archive practices in place to record every single thing that has come out of these quite hidden social scenes. And we're in danger of losing what are some really fantastic initiatives, some really amazing ethos of care that were developed in the community. And I would feel personally that was a major loss.
Completely.
So,
I think a lot of the participants in those movements would feel and do feel that a lot of that is getting lost. And thankfully, through oral history work in particular, that's kind of being recorded and kept keeping us aware.
Yeah.
Do we have any more questions?
I think Nick might be the last one.
That's it for now. Well, if you have any more, we still have some time.
Yeah, and look, Sophie and I are always available to chat. We love chatting. We chat all the time.
Yep. On the way here, on the way home. Yeah.
So email us. Are you using your UNSW address?
Yeah.
So we're both at UNSW. So you can find us easily, and then you can just email us, and we'll come and chat to you.
Yeah, we're very keen to keep this conversation going in some other form, or think about ways that we can continue to share this research with the community. And
yeah. I mean, and going back to some of those sort of inter-community health responses. And I'm just thinking, like, all's not lost though. I'm just thinking about the work that ACON are doing for women's sexual health. I know that that's been a massive driver, and I think that's really born from community, those types of campaigns that they run. So that's some more great examples. I still still don't quite know what the dental dam does, but maybe Viv can explain that to me one day.
I think that's going to be my next research project, is really to delve into, because there was a whole moment in which they were kind of introduced and discussed as to their relevance. But you know, there was some interesting campaigns to try and get lesbians to use them, but there was lots of just funny images of lesbians kind of using them as slingshots.
Yes.
And you know, actually just highlighting that, like, what is this? Like, what is it that actually lesbians need? Because there's not a lot of resources out there and conversations happening about what actually would be useful.
And I think that's the crucial thing, is that some of the games by gay men and for gay men are really useful and can be translated to our communities, but sometimes not.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think the dental dam really works as the women's condom.
That's kind of how it was. Brought in. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's why we need specific research and analyses of women, of lesbian and queer women's social interactions and spaces, because there was so much originality, so much amazing stuff that came out of those spaces. And also, just to reiterate what I said last week, Australia was really at the forefront of some of these queer party scenes. The types of performances that were taking place in some of these spaces in the 70s and 80s and 90s were surpassing anything else in the world.
Yeah.
You know, everyone thinks that New York or Berlin was like the origin of these types of performances, these really incredibly empowering eroticized performances, but most of them actually started here in Australia.
And there's been really a lot of commentary on why that is, and one thing that's come up is just the hedonism of the Sydney scene, that it's got this kind of incredible hedonistic history that various communities have harnessed over time, and lesbians really started to do that in more ways in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah. Just because I can't work this computer that's in front of me, I just want to confirm, have we got any more questions?
Yeah.
We do.
Okay.
Okay. You drive.
All right, let's just see. Oh, here we go. Apologies. Okay. Someone, I think this is in relation to the dental dams. You couldn't get them and they were never available at events. I assume that's about the dental dams. Another question. Oh, we'll do this question. Thank you for fabulous.
It's Johnny Seymour.
Oh, Johnny Seymour.
Hi.
Club Kooky have a no dancing upcoming community art show at the Red Rattler from the 9th of October. So
yeah, so that's another. I mean, exhibition spaces like this are a great way to engage with community members. I think that having this Dyke TV was going to be a great initiative as well. Are you going to have a chat function with the Dyke TV or a comment section? Yeah,
excellent.
Yeah. So we can
I'm
engage
excited
that way.
for that. Nick, again, what are some of the lesbian histories that have still yet to be recorded more fully? Restaurants and cafes, women's lands, music, etc. Where to next with your research?
Are you offering to fund us, Nick?
Yes, please. I think for me, I'm definitely interested in just this telling this story of lesbians involved in the creation of women's services, health initiatives, social justice. Yeah, there's a huge history there of these critical social justice campaigns and services, and the role that lesbians played in starting them, staffing them, really leading the way in that regard. And that's something I'm interested in. And also in sort of a bit different, but still connected, in the 80s and 90s, the kind of emergence of lesbian DJs, or them really sort of owning that scene. I want to tell that story, or, you know, be able to write more about that. And there's some great oral histories that we're starting to record with lesbian DJs about that scene and about what their kind of entry into that scene has been like. That's something I'm really interested in. Yeah. And women's lands, everything. Lesbian history is amazing.
Yeah, and I think it's not just the bars as well. I mean, Sophie and I were just reminiscing about Scrambled on Enmore Road the other, this tonight, actually. You know, and so I don't think there would ever be this kind of sense that we should have archived or at least captured some of the dynamics. But I mean, there was definitely a Dyke kind of vibe at Scrambled.
Oh, I wanted to move to the street just adjacent to it, just so that I could be close to Scrambled and the Sly Fox at one point. Just they were my
Scrambled after.
Yes, that was my kind of goal in life. It never eventuated, but yeah, that was a dream at one point.
Yeah, so I mean, this is definitely some new areas of research for us, and I particularly am definitely keen on trying to find some of those more mundane places that don't attract the same kind of visible, spectacular attention that might circulate around some performance cultures and things like that, and think about how people really looked after each other and kept themselves safe in all these different spaces, and how we can learn from that. Yeah,
absolutely.